Okay. All right, so just for the record of the video, we had to start recording a little late. We just went through the recommendations themselves as listed here, and we are now starting our discussion. So we're starting the recording now. So Pastor Liz, you asked, we just went through this first recommendation, which is that the city can require housing developments that receive city funding to provide enhanced tenants' rights. And so for each of these, we have some more detailed slides. So I can walk through this to provide more information, and then we can talk about that.
I have a question. I was looking for this in the background information. It's not in the, I don't see it in what we were sent. Am I wrong?
No, the detailed, you mean the detailed slide?
Yeah, the one we're looking at right now.
Yeah, that was not sent out ahead of time.
Okay, I'll stop looking for it. Thank you.
Sorry for any confusion.
Okay.
We wanted to keep the set of information we sent ahead of time shorter so that it was more feasible to get through.
Yeah, sure.
So, Pastor Liz asked sort of what those enhanced tenants' rights might be. So for example, the example we provide here is potentially guaranteeing tenants' rights to organize in their buildings, organize to ensure, housing quality and whatnot in their building. And also things like agreeing to just cause eviction protection. So making sure that there's protections against evictions for things like, if someone wants to redevelop a property, other issues such as like that. Just cause eviction would not cover things like not paying your rent or willfully destroying property, but it's other evictions that have no sort of direct cause based on what the tenant has done. So protection against those types of evictions.
Don't we already have those in FAR, and CRHA has a hearing that requires a just cause to evict someone?
I think this would be maybe looking at an expansion of this beyond sort of public housing, beyond CRHA properties for other new developments.
But what other ones receive city funding?
If there is any sort of, I don't know an example off the top of my head in the city, but if the city is contributing any funding to a development, it could be something like infrastructure, helping to develop infrastructure with a property.
Zoning variance? Would zoning variance?
That's a question for Philip and Sarah, I think, because the money piece is what comes to mind with me when there is a funding piece coming from the city. I'm not sure if it's a non-funding piece, what the leverage is there.
Yeah, I can't think of any other thing other than public housing where there's money piece.
Would this be also affected, would the vouchers be included in this?
Sorry.
State vouchers, they're state, aren't they?
The city has some vouchers as well.
But aren't they given to them by the state?
Well, I think the city has its own voucher program that mimics
the voucher program, the city housing voucher program.
So the question is, if a property participates in the voucher program, can the city?
Would the landlords be held accountable to follow this guideline as well for the enhanced tenants' rights?
Let me just make sure I write down that question all the way.
Because and if it doesn't, it shouldn't be just for individuals in public housing.
Right. I don't think the intention is for this to be just focused on public housing.
I think sometimes the city gives out money from the Affordable Housing Fund to developers who want to do affordable housing. So that might be one place where the enhanced tenants' rights might come into play.
Yes, I think, yes, that is. Missy, would that be your understanding as well, that that would be the piece?
I mean, that it would make sense that could link in there. You know, I definitely think that would be something that would make a lot of sense.
So if it doesn't already, then we're suggesting that it should be a piece, and it should be a piece to hold accountability to make sure city funds are being properly allocated, the right resources, and the people who are dedicated to doing the right thing.
Noted. I think that's a good recommendation. It's a piece of the detailed recommendation that we can write down from this group. So thank you for making sure that's clear. All right, I'm going to go to the next one for now. The second tenants' rights recommendation is related to right to counsel. And so what that would be is dedicating funding for the provision of legal services for tenants facing eviction and establish a citywide right to counsel for eviction cases. So this is another one where the city is a bit limited. You know, the city can't directly say that everyone has a right to counsel, but the city can provide funding potentially to provide those legal services. There is, you know, there's sort of an example here from Massachusetts. You know, there's sort of proven strategy to help tenants stay in their homes if they have representation from an attorney, because not every tenant knows what the rules are. Not every landlord is trying to cheat the rules either, of course, but not every tenant knows what the rules are. And so having representation that they might not be able to afford otherwise would allow those folks to stay in their homes potentially. So that's what this is trying to get at.
Doesn't the legal aid justice provide some representation for tenants now?
Yes, I believe they do.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be above and beyond that, correct?
Right.
But there are several cases that they do not take that are related to tenants' rights.
Yeah, and I think this could potentially play out in a program where the city is providing funding to various entities to do this, or to certain entities, but it would be the city just providing enhanced support for those services. But yes, I think overall, a lot of these tools and recommendations, the city has people doing these or has thought about using them from this section and from the other sections. And so a lot of this is talking about how they might be sort of prioritized to be ramped up or ramped up in a targeted way.
And with that, I just want to add some clarity, because I do know of some situations where, and I don't know all of the circumstances, where legal aid did not step in and help tenants who were in some pretty dire situations. So I hope that this is not just limited to legal aid, that maybe there even be another resource that tenants can tap into. Sometimes when you continuously fund one particular nonprofit or organization, you stunt the growth that you want to produce.
Sure.
And you got to be aware of previous practices that may not always benefit equally.
Yeah, I think, and I hear what you're saying, and I think a piece of that sort of the subsidy, speaking of subsidies and funding, I think one thing we're certainly talking about here is what requirements might the city put on folks who are getting funding to do any of these tools? And so I think, you know, that is a piece of this here. What requirements might there be in terms of how that money is being spent?
Right.
So I think that plays in with that.
Accountability.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on the right to counsel topic?
I think it needs to be put in the lease of the landlord that the tenant has a right to counsel and just cause, that they cannot be evicted without just cause in all the leases.
Now, there are some landlords who have their own leases, and they're entitled to have their own leases signed by tenants. Now, we don't want to become so that it isn't a hindrance for landlord to participate and to take on tenants who take on who have, for example, a voucher, that they feel like they have less of a right. I mean, you can review some of their leases, but there are some landlords who have their own leases and they don't want to sign some leases like this. I just don't want us to get into a so strict that we're actually decreasing the landlord's likeliness to participate in the programs.
Sure.
So I just want us to be mindful of that, because we can create a wish list all day long, but if we have this wish list and nobody participates, then we're defeating the purpose. So I'm going to always play devil's advocate. So it's not personal. I'm just pushing back a little because I represent both sides.
Oh, that's exactly right, and that's why we're here. And I think that is something that we've talked about and that we'll continue to talk about as these recommendations keep, getting refined and we're moving forward. We want to make sure we're not putting everything out there to do. We need to prioritize working toward these goals we've established or that we're establishing. And a piece of that is making sure that they are actually implementable, that they are programs that people would participate in. And so your point is well taken. Noted. Let's see, I'm going to go to tenant opportunity to purchase. And so this would be allowing the tenants the opportunity to purchase a property at the time when an owner intends to sell it. We've outlined on this sort of detailed slides some details around what that might look like. It allows tenants to have an opportunity to match an offer that it's made within some reasonable amount of time. For example, we put on here 3 months. It requires people who are purchasing units to make some or all of units to be permanently affordable. And I'm saying these are recommendations we might be making. And another way this could play out is not only offering to existing tenants, but it could be extending an offer to purchase to other community entities, such as nonprofits or others that work to preserve affordable units in the city. We've got our last note on here is saying, this is a lower cost program that would increase some potential to, maintain affordability and build homeownership in some ways. But it does require some specific requirements to make sure that it's not ineffective, I guess is what I would say.
I have a question. So how is this done? Is this like a citywide mandate? Is this something that's voluntary? Is it something like where, it's something like the tenants' rights things where if the city has some kind of funding, how is this done?
It could be built in as, I think it was sort of, let me see if this was included. Yeah, so it could be built in as one of these sort of, if a development is receiving city assistance, then it needs to be offered, it could be one of those requirements within there. Sorry, Lisa, did I interrupt you?
I was just about to say, if they sign a lease, it could be a part of the one of the lease agreements when they go to sign their lease, their yearly lease. If at any point the landlord says, "Hey, you know what? I've been doing this for a while. I continue to rent to you for a number of years, but in about 5 years, I'm really planning to sell." So that would be a great opportunity. If it's not already in the lease to say that, would there be an opportunity to go to the city to say, "Hey, my landlord is willing to work with me on a lease purchase agreement. Is there funding or down payment assistance or whatever?" Definitely.
Does that answer your question, Lena?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa, for that.
But you don't want to add anything more to the lease, Lisa. You just said you didn't want to add anything more to the lease.
But that is not the same thing. So let me be clear that this is simply a right for the landlord who already has a tenant in place to say, hey, you've been a good steward of the home. I'd like to offer you first right of refusal if you're in a position to purchase. So that's not adding any other responsibility from that landlord. It's just the landlord coming to the tenant who's already in place. Nothing extra from him to say, hey, I'm ready to sell. We talked about this. Are you in a position to purchase? That's it. You're just coming directly to the person who's already in place first. So you get the first right of refusal.
And put that in the lease.
I mean, I tend to think of right of first refusal as something that's used when the landlord isn't going to the tenant already, because they could always go to the tenant. I tend to think of this as more of a backstop for a landlord who isn't planning to go to the tenants. Maybe I'm wrong. My name's Lena. I got added late. I have been following a lot of this, but I wasn't at the last meeting where these were discussed in more detail. So I apologize if I'm taking people's time trying to catch up.
Oh, no.
No, this is perfect. This is the first time we're walking through these recommendations. So
you're in at perfect time. And it's just about understanding what it means. That's all. It's just about understanding that you're not adding anything to the landlord's plate. It is just in writing that if he decides to sell, it is mutually understood that he will give you the opportunity first. He's not decreasing any of his rights or anything. He's not losing out, because when they come to ask you, are you in a position to purchase? Either you are or you're not. And if you are not, are they willing to work with you? And if they're not, then he still can go on and sell that property. He's just coming to you and giving you notice. Say, hey, I'm putting this on market. If you are in a position to purchase, go ahead. That's it.
I like this.
He doesn't decrease he doesn't have to decrease his price, his listing price or anything. Just giving you the first opportunity to purchase. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Like it says match an existing purchase offer. So the landlord isn't losing anything. We're just asking for them to give the tenants time to be in the game, as opposed to how it usually happens, where it's like, you know, the renter doesn't know that a place is for sale until it's on the market, and they're not really given an offer. They may need more time. So.
Well, they're just not even asked. They're just not even asked. It just goes up for market.
Yeah.
I'm just giving you a 30-day notice. I'm putting the house up for sale.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so general support for this program, it sounds like. Okay.
Yeah. Is it very effective, do you think? I mean, I'm in favor of it. Anyway, I'm just wondering if it has been seen to be used well, like.
That is a question I'll need to follow up with Philip and Sarah on, to give some examples maybe of how a program can be more effective or not. I think the one thing I did really get out of talking through this was that it really depends on what those stipulations are, or how it's sort of implemented, or how well people know about it. So I think that'd be a big piece of it. But I'm going to follow up with them and get some input on that.
I can tell you that it is a part of everyday real estate. It is not a novel idea. It is part of everyday real estate.
Maybe there should also be like some kind of something from the city that helps support tenants who want to do this, such as, you know, making information available about, you know, how to get funding or group to get, like, I think it would be great if there was something to support it.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of this recommendation that we can suggest.
That's where that down payment assistance comes in.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I want to make sure we have time to at least get to the governance piece, so I'm going to keep going through these. The next two, just cause eviction and rent control, really, these are ones that we really would have, the city would have to advocate at the state level, you know, for enabling legislation so that the city could do these. But I'm happy to talk through them briefly. So again, just cause eviction would be preventing landlords from evicting tenants for reasons that are outside a set of allowable grounds. Allowable grounds here are things that would probably be predictable, such as non-payment of rent or intentionally damaging the rental unit. And so, you know, in this case, that would be the example I would use is if someone wants to redevelop a property, you know, it would be more difficult to evict someone for that. So if the city were to do this, they could, you know, if they were to be allowed to do this, they could, you know, they would create a clear sort of list of what is an allowable cause for an eviction and what's not. Again, we're not trying to say no eviction is warranted, but there would need to be a clear list for that. And sort of a procedure for how landlords prove a just cause from that list. And then, you know, the third sort of piece here is it would need to combine those just cause eviction stipulations with other programs that such as the ones we've been talking about. You know, and this could be something, if it were allowed, that would be required of those properties that receive city funding. So kind of that first piece we talked about. So what we're saying is we would need to advocate for it to be able to use it, but if it is allowed, it could be allowed through some of those requirements for properties getting city funding. Any thoughts on this one?
Is there any hope of dealing with it on the state level?
You know, I mean, I think there is a lot of discussion about eviction right now at the state level.
Richmond is the second highest eviction place in the United States.
Right. So, you know, I can't really say, I guess, what hope there is, but I think we find it to be an important thing to talk about. And, you know, I think if it comes out of this whole process as a big priority, that's something that'll be shared with, you know, those who do that work. And, you know, again, we can't make it happen at the state level, but it could be a recommendation to pursue that. The other piece, as I mentioned, is rent control. And as you know, as we've mentioned, it's not currently allowed for Charlottesville or other jurisdictions to enact rent control. You know, as you probably know, rent control would stipulate how much a landlord can raise rent in a certain amount of time when the lease comes up for renewal. So this would be something that the city would need to advocate for. But it, you know, as noted on here, if it is used, it can really sort of tangibly create benefits for folks from looking at inflation. And so it's, you know, the example that's on here is in some places, you know, on the West Coast in particular right now, they're doing a 5% growth as the limit for that right now. And I think from what I've heard, that's something that is working because it's sort of within the realm of what the maximum might be anyway for most places, but it keeps those really large increases from happening.
I think it would be great if it would be possible, but on the flip side, and knowing real estate and knowing landlords and knowing that being a part of a political action committee that advocates wholeheartedly and funds millions and millions of dollars to advocate for property rights. I think it would be an uphill battle, but I love the idea. I think that it would definitely create a lot of stability for a lot of renters. I love the idea, but I think it would be an uphill battle. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't try it, but
Sure.
just keep that in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the stance we're taking on it. It's something we want to talk about. It's a tool that's certainly used in other places, but it's not the primary tool in the short term for Charlottesville because it can't be right now.
But 5% would mean that it would raise 50% in 10 years. So that's still a tremendous amount of, we've already raised 42% in the last, from 2011 to 2018. So something that cost $600 is now $825.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it has limited, you know, it's still limited benefits. It's just meant to sort of put some sort of cap on those increases. Excuse me. Oops, sorry. My apologies here. Here we go. I think it's not, it's not able to directly completely stop rent increases. It's just meant to keep them to a certain level. So
I mean, even the concept of rent control, it's going to be a long time before we start arguing about percentages. I mean, like, I think we just need to keep it out there, talking about it. Yeah, 5% seems too high, though, if we were making a recommendation.
all right, I hear that. Okay, so I know it's after 5. So I just want to go back to the beginning of this section and say, what we've been asked to do is come out of this with the top, maybe I would say 2 in this group that we say maybe would be priorities. And we're not saying you certainly are not, the final word on this. You don't have that pressure on you, but we just want to, for sort of talking to it today, we want to say, here's what we think are the top 2, and here's sort of some extra thoughts we have about them. So does any of you have thoughts on what those might be based on this list?
I can tell you what is important to me. It's important to me that renters have the first right of refusal, because I think that that's another way to create wealth building, and that is vital for inclusion and equity, which we should always be mindful of throughout this whole process, especially when we talk about the lack of representation in this group, in the steering committee, and also the right to counsel. A lot of times tenants are just put in horrendous situations and just have to go along because they don't understand their rights or they don't have representation.
All right, great, thank you. Liz or Lena, any thoughts on what your top priorities might be? Do you agree with those? Any other thoughts?
I think the right to counsel is absolutely essential, because otherwise we had someone who had paid his rent, but he paid it in cash, and the landlord refused to admit that he'd paid it, and we're trying to evict him.
Okay.
And so finally we got legal aid to help us, and he was shown to have paid it, and he had a receipt, but the landlord wouldn't recognize his receipt.
Got it.
And brought him to be evicted. And because we had counsel there, he was able to keep his place.
Okay, so the importance of a right to counsel, which in this case would be sort of the city setting aside funding for that or helping to fund that ability. Okay. Lena, any thoughts on your priorities with these?
I think I would agree that the right to counsel and tenant opportunity to purchase are, can have the most direct impact for folks that are in either a crisis or a difficult situation. And so I see those as I agree that those 2 are really important.
And one thing I forgot to ask when we were starting was, are any of you comfortable doing the report out during that section?
I don't mind, but can I add something?
Yeah.
Just another suggestion, not just for the right of refusal, but to also add that the city needs to add funding tied to that, because you can have that right in there, but if you don't have support to help you with down payment or anything else that may come up with that you may need assistance with, I mean, you could be dead in the water even if you have that right to first of refusal. So
sure,
giving tools tied to that right, tools to help them be successful.
Yeah.
I think I have a little issue with the wording on how tenant opportunity purchase is written, because it says allow the tenants the opportunity to purchase property. Well, I mean, they're not disallowed from it. You know,
Mm.
they have it. We want to enhance their opportunity to purchase, or you know, I'm not sure what the right word is, but I think something a little more active instead of allow would be a better description there. And I'm
Offer? How about offer?
I agree with you, and that's why I say that there should be some tools to help, such as financial assistance.
yeah,
Or-
absolutely.
I agree with you. Mhm. The city should help in some way.
How about offer the tenants assistance in with their opportunity to purchase a property with the right of first refusal for
Sure.
purchasing a property?
Sure. I think that aligns with what we're talking about. I think that works. Thank you. I think that's a good clarification to make on these.
And I mean, I like the idea of the enhanced tenants' rights, but I kind of am a little nervous about, like, you know, putting the opportunity to purchase underneath that one. It would kind of disappear a little bit, even though it is related. So
Under the
I'm in
tenants'
agreement.
rights, under
Yeah.
the umbrella of tenants' rights.
I mean, we said it could be one of those things, but I would hate to lose that one as a key point.
Sure. Well, I think the idea here is that, you know, these recommendations we're talking about today, both in our group and in the other groups, are just the first cut. They're sort of the first ideas. And so they will be condensed down. Well, not necessarily condensed down, but the list will be whittled, I guess I will say, and refined. And
Gotcha.
so when the final list of recommendations comes out, they will be sort of, I think, more clear on their own and talking about the pros, you know, sort of the reasons we're recommending each of them. So I think they will jump out more in the final list, if that makes sense.
Yep. Thanks.
All right. Well, I know there were some things we want to follow up on with this, and they're in my notes. So if I didn't answer your question on these, I promise I will get you the answers, if not in the report out with the group after the meeting. But for now, I'm going to skip to not funding, governance. And so we talk about governance. We're talking about strategies to shape how effective and equitable decision-making is when it comes to implementing housing programs and working towards specific community outcomes. And so the sort of purpose of governance and sort of the main practices we're thinking about with governance are formalizing processes to set priorities for spending public funds, which kind of is similar to that first item we talked about in the last group. For the second purpose we've got on here is making sure that community voices are included and empowered in the conversation, including those who benefit from public funded housing programs in these decision-making processes. So I know, as Lisa, you're talking about representation on the steering committee, and what we're talking about here is representation on other groups as well. Sort of the third purpose with these governance tools is building trust in public processes by providing clear communication about what priorities sort of exist behind those processes, and then also reducing conflicts of interest in those processes, which often comes out in sort of representation on these different decision-making groups. And then the fourth purpose we've got on here is ensuring the successful implementation of recommendations by aligning city capacity with those needs and priorities. So making sure that where the city is supporting these efforts, that they have the ability to do that and the capability. So we've got, three recommendations on here, and I'm glad we have Lisa on here with us from the HAC. It'll be interesting to hear your perspective on these. But overall, the recommendation is we want to build governance structures that institutionalize an equitable implementation of this plan that we're working on developing now. And so the three pieces that come out with that are the Housing Advisory Committee, or the HAC, the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund, or the CAF committee, and then a city staff capacity. And so the three recommendations are for the HAC to reform the structure and function of the Housing Advisory Committee to build trust and improve its impacts. And we can talk more about that in a second. with the CAF, our recommendation is to empower a committee with community representation to make recommendations about the priorities and distribution of the CAF money. When it comes to city staff capacity, our recommendation is to realign priorities, increase capacity, and empower staff to be collaborative with advocates and responsive to community needs. And so having more capacity to work with advocates, developers, and others to really work toward these goals we're establishing. So we do have some detailed slides on these that we can talk through, but I just want to get some of your reactions up front. Any thoughts on these 3 recommendations?
What is the structure and function of the hack, Lisa?
I'm happy to talk through that.
Get my mute button off. There's a great definition.
Yeah, we pulled some information on here. In general, it's a public committee intended to provide City Council with recommendations about housing policy and funding priorities. Would you agree with that definition? Okay. So that's the definition of it. I can walk through some ways that we're suggesting we might want to adjust that. One would be sort of refocusing the hack on providing City Council with recommendations about housing policy and funding priorities, particularly around, I think, the outcome of this plan that we're working on. Our second piece of this recommendation would be looking at reducing potentially the number of seats on the committee and making the seats council appointed with these sort of term limits that are built in now. The third piece of this would be increasing the representation of community members, particularly those who are beneficiaries of housing programs, and then also giving regional representatives voting power. And that regional piece comes in, as you saw, it's one of the sort of guiding principles we're thinking about. Having this regional collaboration is really important for a lot of pieces of the comprehensive plan, but for housing certainly is one of them. And then the sort of final piece of this recommendation is developing some sort of, as we say, onboarding educational process. When people joins the Housing Advisory Committee, we want to make sure that they have training, especially for community members who aren't well-versed in these topics, to make sure that they're really empowered and successful in participating. I know that's been, for example, something that's been used in some of the recent public housing and other redevelopment that's happening in the city. And so it's something that we're suggesting maybe could work for the hack as well. I'm sorry, I'm just getting a notice from Latoya. She's warning us we have 15 minutes to go before we have to go back. So anyway, Pastor Liz, does this clarify this for you at all? Do you have other questions?
Well, I have some questions.
Mm-hmm.
How are the seats appointed now to the hack? If they're not appointed by the council now, who appoints them?
Missy, can you clarify that for me, or ask Lisa? I want to make sure I'm correct.
I don't know if the process is necessarily very formal. I know that a number of the housing providers in the community have at least a representative on there. And I know at one point it was folks who showed up. I think the recommendation of giving some structure could be very helpful.
I can tell you how I was appointed. And if you get down the list, it seems to be based on recommendations, and it seems to be anybody who's tied into the housing industry, and a lot of nonprofits sit on there as well who deal in housing. I was approached because my predecessor was leaving the committee due to family issues. So I was a council member, reached out to Free Enterprise, Neil Williams, and Neil recommended me with the Charlottesville Association of Realtors president at that time suggested that I would be a good representative based on my knowledge, based on my life experience, and based on my commitment to housing. And when I sit on the board, I represent a multitude of individuals. So I felt blessed to be on that board. But I also understand why some individuals want to revamp it, rebuild it, because they're, in my opinion, representing no one but me, I do feel that there are a lot of individuals who sit on the hack and who have been on the hack way before my time, who sit on the hack and have influence and may not vote on at the time when funding is decided upon, but they have sat at the table and had influence and is going to directly benefit from the funds that are suggested to be given by City Council. So, and I totally agree that when about having training, because oftentimes that is the justification as to why the same individuals sit on the hack. Well, we're nonprofit, we know the process, we know how things are run, so that's why they remain, and that's how they continuously sit on certain boards. Well, how about you give me more education? I'm willing, and I'm more representative of the community in which you're making decisions about. So why not give me that same opportunity to go out and get knowledge? I'm open for it. And then you have clarity and you have transparency, and people who are sitting on the board are not directly benefiting from some of their influence on the board.
Sure, and I mean,
financially.
There is so. Sorry, I don't mean to keep interrupting you. I think that's a really clear point you made, and I think, you know, in Charlottesville, there's such a wealth of knowledge. There really are. There's so many organizations working toward housing, you know, fixing housing, and in the region and in Charlottesville, and so, you know, certainly can acknowledge that great wealth of knowledge that's out there, but also acknowledge there's a lot of people who aren't involved in these processes, and that we can use that, you know, knowledge we have to build up others to participate. So point well taken. I've noted that here.
Are you sure that the council appointing them will make them diverse enough and will really represent the community? I don't think so.
Well, so part of, sorry, go ahead.
I was about to say, people tend to appoint and recommend people that are like them. Mm-hmm. And I can't say that I have the answer, but I don't think that that's necessarily the way, because I think that there's already a lot of distrust in that process.
Yeah, I'm not sure that a council appointed people would really work. Lisa, where do you work? Who do you work with?
I am what's called an independent contractor. I work for myself, but my license is held with Keller Williams. I am a real estate expert in Charlottesville, Albemarle, and Green. Okay.
So you would not necessarily be appointed if you were dependent upon the council?
No, I could. I have the expertise. I'm an expert in housing. Mm-hmm. And I have served on housing boards throughout the city. So, and there you go. Why would I not be selected? Why would I not? Is the focus more on nonprofits? Is the focus more on more LLCs than people with lived experience, people with other expertise? And you know, that's why you gotta break that that institutional structure of always going with what has always worked. Always worked for who?
Yeah, I mean, I brought up this slide that we had as sort of our initial something to talk about around this topic of how should it look if we're suggesting maybe there should be changes. And so the way that the one idea we have is, you know, you can see here, I know we haven't talked about the cap right now, but if you look on the left side here, we've got some thoughts about how, you know, you could break out sort of proportionally, have a set of affordable housing providers and advocates who, again, we know there are a lot of them in the region and we don't want to lose that knowledge in this process. Having some members who are affordable housing developers or housing developers that are involved in that. Then having that community member component, having a set number of community members who should be involved. And then, as we've been talking about, could receive that training to make sure that they are well equipped to participate in the process. And then also having some regional representatives, again, to address that regional component with housing. So this is what we know, one of the ideas we put forth here. How does this look to you all? Does this seem like a good sort of breakdown, or would you change that?
How do you define affordable housing providers and advocates?
Mm-hmm.
Just like Liz said, under this model, would I have been selected?
I think it's up. I mean, this is so very early in this process, so I think we're helping to define what that means is what my answer would be to that. But I think
because all too often it is what has always been, and it is always the same people that look like the other people who are already there, and it never includes a diverse mix of individuals. I think I'm the only female besides staff, and the only voting minority member on the PAC, and I'm the only one that is okay with challenging the status quo. And normally it is only after I have spoken that things start to go in a different direction, because a lot of times they just want to get through it, and they just resort back to what has always worked, and it is not progressive.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think you need to rethink this about whether the city council should be appointing these folks, because the city council can predominantly appoint folks just like themselves.
Do you all have any thoughts on how that might work? Or it might be a pending question too.
I think that that one of the things that was mentioned, the reason for these changes are to build trust. And I'm not sure that I have enough information here to understand how this this seems a little more complicated to me than I think we could do. Like just looking at this quickly, I'm like, okay, affordable housing providers and developers and regional representatives. I mean, that could very easily be no different than what we have. It's just a smaller number.
Sure.
A couple of community members, maybe a couple of advocates, and it just, I'm not convinced that this is the solution. Maybe it is. I just don't have enough information in front of me to say that this is going to fix everything.
Sure. Yeah.
You're raising the same point that I did about what does that mean? What does it mean? Affordable housing provider and an advocate. Who does that represent? What does that look like? I think we're saying the same thing, because all too often the only individuals that fit in this category are the ones that currently sit on there, and a lot of them are the nonprofits or the ones who think totally different from the individual families that they're supposed to be helping.
All right, so what I'm hearing, and I understand, I think this is a good recommendation, is that I would say there needs to be more clarity about what these topics mean if we are going to suggest having, these breakouts similarly worded to this. It would need more clarity in who is a housing provider, who is a housing developer, what does that mean? Is there proportionally, is there any group that you think is not represented in this list, or that you would want to make sure is pulled out in that clarification of who should be represented?
I mean, it doesn't even say on here a low-income person. Just because it's a community member doesn't mean it's going to be somebody who's low income or somebody who lives in affordable housing. Housing provider, advocates. There's nothing in here that says a recipient is on there.
Mhm.
It just says community members, and who does that represent? And sometimes that's just who raises their hand the quickest.
Yeah, a community
Yeah.
member can be somebody, it can be anybody, really.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's a good clarification. And that was sort of a piece of the earlier discussion, but you're right, it's not reflected on this slide. And it's an important piece of, if that's what we mean by community member, it needs to be on here. So I've noted that. I think we should bring that up as one of our,
We need
points.
to bring up the gender equality and the ethnic equality too.
sure.
Yeah.
You can't
Diversity.
have this group just be all white males.
Which is, it has typically been.
Agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I see
Same
them,
old, same
so
old.
it's typically been that.
Sure.
And
Can
they
we-
recommend the same type of individuals that look like them. I mean, we're here to progress, so I'm going to speak honestly and candidly.
I'm with you, Lisa.
Lena, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, I was just looking at the time.
Yep.
Honestly.
Yeah, I think LaToya is probably here to pull us back in a few minutes. How are the other
Not yet. You
discussions
still got
going?
3 minutes. You're fine.
Okay.
Keep going.
Okay, let's briefly, well, let's talk about this. Do we want to either formulate in the next couple minutes our some really clear thoughts about the hack recommendation that we want to say to others, or do you want to talk through this CAF piece? I think we have some clear things that came out of the hack discussion that we can report out, but Lisa, did you offer up to do that report out, by the way? I'm saying that seriously. I thought I remembered you doing that. I'm not trying to put it on you if you didn't.
But I mean, what am I going to say? I've taken some notes, but I mean, I know that from the tenants, we talked about tenants' rights and having the right to counsel and the first right of refusal. I mean, I can talk on that, but what else are we talking about? We're talking about the hack and whether or not that needs to be, reformulated, rebuilt, tore down, and reorganized, and how many members it should be. Should it be appointed, not appointed? Still
Yeah,
trying
I
to
think
get those details out.
I think you hit the nails on the head. I think from that first part of the discussion, the tenants' rights, the real outcomes of that, which I think there was some, agreement from all three of you on this, was that sort of tenant right to purchase or first right of refusal, is an important thing to think about. But we wanted to be more clear around enhancing that ability, not just allowing it, but enhancing it. And I think that's an important thing to bring out. The other piece, what we talked about, was right to counsel.
Right, and also there seemed to be consensus around, if the city provides funding, that additional tenants' rights definitely need to apply in those cases.
Funding around the right to property, the top.
Yep. Okay, great. I think we're going to pull that any second here, but with the hack, what I would focus on is, from our discussion, we do think there should be changes, or from your discussion, 60 seconds.
The
But,
diversity part of it.
yes. I would focus on what you think should be those really key changes to the hack. And so before we get broken out, thank you for this discussion. This was really great. We've recorded this. It'll be shared. I think it's a good discussion. I know we didn't get to the CAF piece, but there will be an opportunity. I can't imagine most groups got through every single piece of their. So we will be providing an opportunity to weigh in on everything.
We did have a delay. So.
Great feedback, everyone. I appreciated that.
Yeah, thank you for the active discussion. I'll see you back in the yellow room.
Okay. Thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Pastor.